Yeah, that's okay. So SEC Media Day is obviously going on this week. We've been trying to keep up with everything going on, but we've been talking about this posturing between the Big Ten and SEC, and almost it feels like it's like a Cold War. It's like an arms race of either takes and coaches trying to get ahead of one of another. What was the general vibe there at SEC Media Days just throughout the week? Did you get a sense of that there was tension when it came to the college football playoff type of conversation? Because it felt like that's been the primary quotes that we've been kind of absorbing out here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would describe it as tension necessarily. I think it's just like the SEC is no stranger to posturing, and a lot of it comes from Greg Sankey. I mean, very he's very honest, I guess, about how he views the national landscape. He's definitely going to rally for his conference, and he's definitely been probably the most vocal about the SEC getting its share. I know there was a moment where Kirby Smart also kind of took a little bit of a shot at the Big Ten, I guess, when he was talking about automatic qualifiers. I don't know if I would say it's tension. I just think that it's SEC coaches rallying for their conference and rallying for their schools. Obviously, they want the SEC to look supreme, and because they get a slice of that pie, and so they're going to go to bat for their conference just to make it look good.
Well, let me ask you this, because there's a report that came out yesterday from Brett McMurphy that the Big Ten has said that they will not budge on their preferred playoff stance with the automatic qualifiers unless the SEC gives up only playing 8 conference games and they move to a 9th. So let me ask you what you think is most likely. Number one, that it's a AQ system, the 4-4-2-2-3-1, that it's a 5-11 system, and that the SEC goes to 9 conference games, or that this time next year it's still a 12-team playoff because they couldn't come to any arrangement?
I think the AQ system is most likely. I just think that that's what has the most momentum. I don't think there's a lot of SEC coaches that are very keen on going to a 9-game schedule, because they argue that playing an 8-game SEC schedule is as tough as playing a 9-game schedule in any other conference. Whether that's fair or not, I don't necessarily think it is. I mean, I think the Big Ten is just as tough, and it's on the same level. I mean, even like you might not look at the Big 12 on the same national landscape, but that conference is
deep.
Like those teams
super deep.
Are up every single week. That's a tough schedule to play. And so I just don't see the SEC budging on that. And I think that they've got enough weight to throw around where eventually they'll kind of be able to just get that, AQ model passed. And I think the Big Ten would go along with it, because the Big Ten greatly benefits from it too. It's not like they're completely left in the dark by it. Like they also get 4 automatic qualifiers. But I don't think it would be too hard to convince them to go along with it.
Well, let me ask you this, because you brought up something there that's been a very, I'll be honest, I've yelled about this a couple times with this idea that the SEC believes an 8-game SEC schedule is as difficult or more difficult than a 9-game schedule in any other conference. Like, why do we let them get away with this? Like Kentucky's not any better than Minnesota. Like Tennessee's not any better than Illinois. Like, why do we let them get away with this?
I mean, I think it just has to do with perception and how, excuse me, the SEC is presented, kind of on the national media landscape. Obviously, they dominate a lot of coverage because they bring in a lot of money. Like at the end of the day, it's kind of what it's about. And there's no doubting the SEC's success. I mean, the SEC is an extremely successful conference. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, the SEC is overrated or the SEC hasn't had the success that they tout. Like, for years, from 2019 to 2022, they won national championships. I know the Big Ten has just won back-to-back, but the SEC is always at or near the top of the sport. And so naturally, they kind of get a lot more of that coverage. But it is kind of one of those top-heavy things, right? And when you really break it down, it's kind of like the structure of a normal conference. You've got your teams right there at the top, like Georgia, Texas, Alabama most years. You've got some teams that are kind of hanging around near the top, like Tennessee, or traditionally in Oklahoma. I know they had a rough first year in the SEC, but they should be kind of in that tier that's right up there near the top. And then a bunch of teams that have a lot of variation. And that's kind of the structure that you see with most conferences. And, the SEC just has resources. They get a lot of talent. They get a lot of coverage. And so they're able to kind of project that power. But, I don't think that there's a ton of difference between them and other conferences just in terms of structure.
So when you look at this conversation between the Big Ten and the SEC in terms of just that national notoriety and how the pendulum always seems to somewhat point towards the SEC, what does the Big Ten need to do to either even out that conversation and playing field? Is it as simple as keep kind of doing what you're doing, back-to-back national champions from your conference, or is there something from that the SEC has done over the past 2 decades outside of success on the football field that has led to them being able to dominate and kind of control the narrative when it comes to these college football playoff conversations?
I actually think we're starting to see the narrative shift a little bit. I mean, I think the loudest voices about the SEC's dominance are coming from the SEC itself.
Mm-hmm.
And, kind of networks that might be tilted towards the SEC a little bit, like the SEC network. Like I think a lot of people are starting to realize that, especially the Big Ten is catching up. Like I did an article recently when Brett Bielema kind of got into it on Twitter with some people, where I took the stats and data and looked at kind of the SEC's record against teams or conferences in recent years, SEC's postseason success in recent years. And the Big Ten had a 7-1 postseason record against the SEC last year. They've had a pretty close to a winning record against the SEC the last couple of years. And so, they're really starting to catch up. And I think people are starting to realize, teams like Ohio State, teams like Michigan, teams like Penn State are really investing a lot of money in this modern era to kind of, lessen that gap. Even Illinois is, throwing its NIL weight around. They gave Luke Altmaier a lot of money to stick around. And I think the NIL era has helped even that playing field, because you've seen a lot of Big Ten teams have an equal level of buy-in that a lot of SEC teams have. And there's even teams outside of those two conferences like Texas Tech, and teams like that have really acclimated well to the NIL era. And they've been, using that to kind of try to lessen the gap and put their teams ahead.
Will, you mentioned some teams there. This is sort of a broader college football question, but you mentioned some teams there that kind of are throwing around their weight with money that maybe people wouldn't expect. Texas Tech, you mentioned Illinois is throwing around some money. SMU is a team that's flush with cash. Who, as this has started to play out, have you just kind of been stunned that you're like, I did not realize they had that kind of cash?
I mean, I'm not a Texas boy. I know football is obviously very serious in the state of Texas. I think I was pretty stunned by what Texas Tech has been able to do,
mm-hmm.
and just kind of the amount of money and investment that they've been throwing around. They're probably more bought in than any school in the nation, or at least on the same level as an LSU, right? You see LSU throwing silly money around on a yearly basis. I think that they're right there on that level. They are in the absolute top tier of NIL spending. And so I know, obviously, Texas Tech has a pretty solid football history. Mike Leach years were great. But, they're not a team that you look at as traditionally being kind of in that powerhouse. And all of a sudden, here they come in the NIL era, taking full advantage of it. I would say I was a little bit surprised by that.
Will, just going through, we hear from the heavy hitters in the SEC, and there's a lot of focus, of course, on the Alabamas and even the Auburns, Floridas, the teams that could be on the rise. But I'm curious your thoughts on some of these other programs, and I want to focus on 2, because it feels like because of the success that they had last year, and they have a great namesake quarterback in Vanderbilt, there's more talk about them this season than I think we've heard in most other media days. But what about some of these other teams like Arkansas and even Oklahoma, to that matter? Oklahoma gets a little bit more of the national conversation run, but what's happening with the Razorbacks? It feels like in my scope of what I've seen, those two are kind of being left out of a lot of the conference conversation.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that the SEC is wide open, because I don't think that's fair to say. I think you're going to see a lot of the same teams competing for, that SEC championship and college football playoff spots. But I do think that there's a lot of potential for chaos. And I mean, there was a fair amount last year. We saw Vanderbilt beat Alabama, and we saw Oklahoma beat Alabama. I wouldn't be surprised if similar stuff like that happens this year. one team that doesn't normally get a lot of preseason hype that I think is going to probably, that I think has a good shot to make the playoff this year is South Carolina. And I really like, because South Carolina has a great quarterback in Lenora Stellers. I really like the way that Shane Beamer has built up that defense. Like, they lost some really good draft picks on the defense, and I think that they still have a lot of really good guys coming back. Dylan Stewart, a really young former 5-star edge rusher who really stood out as a freshman last year. I think he's just going to be better with more collegiate experience under his belt. So I think South Carolina has a really good shot at pushing for a playoff. I don't think Vanderbilt's going to make a playoff like Diego Pavia would have you believe, but I do think Vanderbilt is going to be a dangerous team and not like the typical, it's Vanderbilt, like we got. Like, I think you're actually going to have to put a lot of effort, towards beating Vanderbilt and really plan for them. And so, I could even see Mississippi State taking a big step and definitely pushing for bowl eligibility and maybe even beating a couple teams that you're like, I didn't see that happening. So, I think the water level's rising all around the conference, and so, like I said, not that I'm sitting here and telling you that a Vanderbilt or even a South Carolina is going to come out of the blue and win the SEC. But those are I think are dangerous teams that are kind of outside that upper echelon that everybody focuses on. That could definitely give some of those more prominent teams a scare this year.
Well, I think part of the perception of the SEC being a little bit more wide open this year has to do with so many teams having new or unproven quarterbacks, right? Obviously, Arch Manning hasn't been a full-time starter. Austin Simmons over at Ole Miss. You've got Gunnar Stockton at Georgia, Ty Simpson at Alabama. Of those teams, I know the easy answer is Arch, right? Where people just assume between Sark and the weapons and the talent around him that he's going to, just come in and be who we expect him to be. Of those four guys, though, or if you've got one off the board that I didn't mention, who do you think is going to be able to elevate their team in a way like their previous starter did or past what their previous starter did?
I'm going to eliminate Arch because he's the obvious answer.
Okay, I like that.
I'll go with Austin Simmons at Ole Miss. Obviously a lot has been made of the fact that he's still just 19 years old. He's already graduated college, so he's very clearly a very smart guy. So, I don't think there's any question that he's mentally capable of running a college football offense. I think it's also really telling that Lane Kiffin, who's the portal king, who always uses the transfer portal really heavily to plug holes on his roster. He's also a really good quarterback guru. Like, he's developed a lot of really good quarterbacks in his career, so he knows the position extremely well. I think it's very telling that he did not take any transfers that could seriously push Simmons for the job. They took a couple guys for depth, but they didn't take anybody to come in and realistically be a starting option, just kind of a break glass in case of emergency type of guy. So that shows the faith that Kiffin and his staff have in Simmons to continue running and operating the offense at a high level. And if he's investing that much into a guy, and if he has that much belief in a guy, then I think it's definitely a guy that's worth keeping an eye on.
So, Will, I want to talk about, I totally agree with that answer, but I want to talk about the other two guys for a second here, because I find Ty Simpson at Alabama and Gunnar Stockton at Georgia really interesting, because the guys they were replacing were pretty maligned at times in Jalen Milroe and Carson Beck. Seems like Georgia fans couldn't get Carson Beck out of town fast enough. Miami was obviously happy to take him on board. Jalen Milroe, we all know about his kind of ups and downs over the course of the season with Alabama. Do you think at any point over the course of the year that either of those teams will find themselves wishing they had their old quarterback back?
I think Georgia's in really good hands with Gunnar Stockton. Like, I really like what I saw from him in the SEC championship game and the playoff. And I think Georgia has also done a lot to elevate its wide receiver core, so that's going to help him a lot. Mm-hmm. So I like Gunnar Stockton. I think that Georgia's going to be happy with him. Alabama, I'm a little bit less certain on. I think Ty Simpson's good. I don't know if he's the type of quarterback that's going to completely elevate an offense. And obviously at Alabama, he's going to have a lot of help too. When you're throwing the ball to like Ryan Williams and Jeremy Bernard, that's not a difficult job. And he's also playing behind arguably the best offensive line in college football. So he's got a great support system to succeed. So he doesn't need to be, like a really standout game-winning type quarterback. he can afford to be a little bit more of a game manager. I just don't know if he's going to be, I don't know if he has a very high ceiling. He definitely doesn't have the ceiling of Jalen Milroe, but I would say that he has a bit of a higher floor, just kind of given his skills and abilities, and also just the support structure around him and just the familiarity, going into a second year of Kalen DeBoer's offense, whereas Milroe just had, a year of it. And so he's got a little bit more time to kind of acclimate to it and get used to it. So I think Alabama's going to be okay. I like Gunnar Stockton more, but I think Ty Simpson will be solid for Alabama. Not somebody that's, going to be near the top of the conference in terms of stats at the end of the year, but he'll be able to keep Alabama's offense, humming, I think.
Which coach is on the hotter seat or has the higher potential to be fired at the end of the season with a winning season, but not a college football playoff appearance? Kalen DeBoer or Brian Kelly?
I would say I would probably lean towards Brian Kelly. I know it would be a lot more money to fire him, but at this point, if LSU just wins 9 games, and it's a good season. It's a season that a lot of teams would really love to have, but it's just not the standard that it's up to. At that point, I think that LSU is willing to accept, all right, we're just kind of spinning our wheels here. We've got to cut bait and move on, especially with how much investment they've got in that program, how much NIL money that they've been, utilizing to improve the roster. I think this is probably the best roster overall that Kelly has had at LSU. I know he had a Heisman winner at quarterback in Jaden Daniels, and there's been plenty of draft picks, but I think when you look top to bottom, every position, this is the best roster he's had. So if they don't do it this year, I just don't think he's going to do it. And so I think that LSU would probably at that point realize that same thing, hey, this isn't going to happen. And so I think that that's when they'd make the call to move on and, go identify another coach. Now, if Alabama goes 8-4, I think Kalen DeBoer is going to be in some really hot water. I think it's more likely that, if they're both sitting there at the end of the year with a winning record, neither one makes the playoffs. I think LSU is more likely to make a move at this point.
Will, if I give you Texas or the field to win the SEC, who are you taking?
I think I would take Texas right now. And that's just because, I think there's a good bit of offensive uncertainty with Texas. Obviously, Texas is going to be great hands at quarterback with Art. There's some question marks at wide receiver. They also lost 4 offensive line starters. But just the way that Sarkisian has recruited there, both high school and the transfer portal, was absurd. It's right neck and neck with Georgia. And so, I think I would, if I'm taking the field, then I'm saying the field because I like Georgia. And I think at this point, I would slightly take Texas over Georgia.
There you go. That's Will Backus, CBS Sports. Will, appreciate the time as always. And hey, just 6 short weeks and we're in college football season, bud. Here we go.
I can't wait.
All right, Will, we appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Will.
Yeah, appreciate it.
That's Will Backus from CBS Sports. One of the check marks on the way to college football season is always, for us at least, Pinnacle Bank Championship. Make sure you get out to the PinnacleBankChampionship.com today to get your tickets, and you can take in all the action at the Pinnacle Bank Championship presented by Woodhouse. Make sure you get to the PinnacleBankChampionship.com for your tickets.
Do you agree with him on the DeBoer and Kelly?
I don't actually.
I think it's DeBoer.
I think DeBoer's on a hotter seat.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
I think LSU would rather ride it out a little bit longer.
Yeah, I don't
disagree with him on his point.
The reasoning is fair.
Yeah, I don't disagree because I think there will come a time when LSU will go, what is the juice worth the squeeze here with Kelly? But I think DeBoer is in a very hostile and volatile situation.
Yeah.
And when you replace a coach like Saban,
yeah,
the expectation is astronomically higher than anywhere that it was after Orgeron left LSU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously people know Orgeron didn't leave LSU in the same place that obviously Saban did, even though he did win the national championship. Things were deteriorating at LSU. I do think that was, in terms of what was in the cupboard, a more difficult job to take over in terms of perception and expectations than Alabama was maybe the hardest job to take over ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think they had to pay a premium to get a coach to do that. Not that they wouldn't have paid high dollar anyway. But I do think there was probably like a 10% premium to be like, hey, I know I'm probably getting fired at some point, so like I'm going to need a little extra here.
Yeah,
because that's the case when you're taking over for Nick Saban. Like you have to expect. I know coaches don't think this way. Like I understand that.
Yeah,
but if you're a normal person, you have to expect to get fired. You know you're not going to do the job that they expect at this point. Taking over for Nick Saban, it almost doesn't matter how successful you are.
Kalen DeBoer, match these 7 national championships, please.
Yeah, like it almost does not matter how successful you are. And like we saw that with Frank Solich. Like it's almost impossible to take over in a situation like that. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter how much you win. You're not Nick Saban.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. And so I think that's the biggest issue here for DeBoer in Alabama. I think DeBoer is a great football coach. I don't hope he gets fired, but I hope he gets to move on from Alabama soon.
Right.
Because I don't think that's a good.
You want DeBoer in the Big Ten?
I want him in the Midwest somewhere. I think it's a good fit for him.
Think he'd go back to Washington? Would that be open?
Maybe. I mean,
I don't know if this quickly, unless Washington spirals out of control this season.
I don't think I think it's more likely that they're good and Jed Fish gets hired somewhere else.
Okay.
I think that's
I could see that
more likely than them spiraling out of control. I don't think they're gonna have a great year, but I think it's more likely they win a couple more than I think than they lose a couple more than I think. I think they're a 6-7 win team, but if they win 8 or 9, like Jed Fish might get hired somewhere else. He's a good football coach. I don't know that he'd go back to Washington. I think he ultimately would like ending up being back in the Midwest. He feels like a Big Ten-ish type coach. I don't know what program makes sense for him, but
yeah,
I do think it'd be interesting.
Well, USC.
Yeah. I mean, maybe if Lincoln, yeah.
What are the chances that they go 10-3, miss the playoff, right? Just by inches again.
Alabama?
Yeah. Riley gets fired. Maybe DeBoer is on the hot seat, right?
And
maybe,
he decides to go.
And he decides, maybe I just go to USC.
Honestly, I was thinking I do wonder about Sharon Moore in Michigan.
That would be interesting, especially if things don't go well.
He's got the suspension.
Mm-hmm.
If things don't go well again, let's say they finally lose to Ohio State. Let's say the Bryce Underwood thing. Doesn't go the way you want it to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he gets fired after this year.
That would be a very interesting one.
But I do think things are a little dicier for Sharon Moore at Michigan than people want to admit.
Mm-hmm. And he's a quarterback guy. You want to convince Bryce to stay.
Yeah.
Top dollar and a quarterback coach coming in.
I mean, yeah, Kalen DeBoer has done a great job with quarterbacks. So I do wonder about Sharon Moore. That's one where I look at, I go, that's obviously a really good job and a coach that I don't know that people are enamored with.
Yeah.
The other,
man, the Big Ten would celebrate that as a huge win.
The
Alabama coach and brought it to one of your premier programs.
The other one that you think about, I think that can have some domino effects here. Obviously, I think Ryan Day is safe now, but if he decides to take an NFL job, or I do think that's sort of on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Marcus Freeman has been talked a lot about. Obviously, Ohio State alum, doing really well at Notre Dame. If Notre Dame comes open because of a domino effect with Ryan Day and Marcus Freeman, Kalen DeBoer at Notre Dame is very interesting.
Oh, that would be. And it's a Midwest program. You get all the independent status with it.
Yeah.
You get all the privilege that comes with that too. That would be interesting. Yeah. But I think all three that we've named so far, I think that those are three that are not as volatile situations as where he stands right now.
No, Alabama, for whoever took over for Nick Saban was going to be in the most hostile situation in the country, like immediately. That's why I didn't want him to take the job. I get it. Just from a financial standpoint, I get it. And I probably would have taken the job too, because it's like, well, even if I get fired, they're going to pay me this out, and I'll definitely get another job still. So who cares? But again, most coaches don't think that way. I get why he takes the job. I also get why Sark wasn't interested. I get why Mike Norvell wasn't interested. I get why other people were not interested in that job. That's the worst job to take over in that moment, maybe in the country. Like just a total hostile environment, no matter how much you win.
And Alabama knew it too. You had to overpay to get someone to come in and do that.
I think it was, he would have had to at least make like a college football semifinal this year to even keep the Wolves at bay.
Yeah, right.
So that's just a terrible spot.
Standard is a standard.